Hello, welcome to the Theology Pugcast. It's just the old gang together again, and we're glad to be with you. I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor, and I serve a church in the Pacific Northwest, and it's raining. So, nothing new. Actually, it's kind of new. We haven't had any rain really for a few weeks, actually a few months. But I think we're just on the cusp of the rainy season again. But anyway, rather than rain on your parade, you guys, I'll just kind of hand it over to you. One last thing. I'm a senior editor at Touchstone Magazine. Okay, Glenn, how about you?
I'm Glenn Sunshine. I'm a retired history professor. I am a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. I run my own ministry, Risk Ranch Ministries, and I work on and off for Reflections Ministries down in Atlanta.
Okay, Tom, let's kick it over to you. Introduce yourself and get us into the topic of the day. It looks like a fun one.
Okay, so I'm Tom Price. It is about to rain here as well on the East Coast in Connecticut. That's where I reside. I teach systematic theology, Christian ethics, philosophy, and a few other things. One of the places is Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. Topic of the day, an article by the now famous Paul Kingsnorth. Kingsnorth. Yep.
Yeah.
Sorry here. Paul Kingsnorth, English writer, resides in Ireland. He's, I think, a graduate of St. Anne's College in Oxford.
Oh, I didn't know.
And then he was a writer for a lot of things, involved very much so with the environment, and kind of went from atheism to Orthodox Christianity for anyone interested in his own story. And here we have an article that they did publish in Unheard. I think a longer version of something he did, maybe in Substack. I'm not sure where it originated. Yeah. And it is called "The Illusion of a Pagan West: Modernity Has Descended into a Spiritual Void." And a very well-written article. I think anyone interested will probably put it in the show notes so they can track down the genuine article here. But I think getting into the kind of description of what he presents is a good way into it, where he starts visiting the Colosseum in Rome during some recent travels. And he did some reflection on the Colosseum, thinking about just how monumental it is and how big and lasting it is, and then the history of it as sort of imperial and conquering and triumphant and all these kind of strong, hard values of the Roman Empire. But he asks an interesting question. He says, what is it about ancient Rome that still speaks to us? And he puts it this way. I'm going to do a few quotes because they're worth quoting. The question wandered around in my head as I wandered around Rome. What is it about ancient Rome that still speaks to us? Why has everybody heard of Nero, Julius Caesar, Marcus Aurelius? Why do we all still know 2 millennia later about Roman baths, gladiators, straight roads, centurions, Vestal virgins, and the Colosseum? Because I like to spend my holidays developing spurious and light evidence theories about human culture as I drink my espresso. It's my idea of fun. But this time around, my theory was simple and unoriginal. The Roman Empire has never really actually ended. So I just want to throw that out there. As we've often talked on the show, and we see floating memes around about how men are always sitting around thinking about the Roman Empire. What is it? What is it about it? And why would he make such a strong suggestion that it really has never left us?
Yeah, I think it's a great observation. And he contrasts, say, Babylon, and maybe Egypt. We don't think about those places very often, although we recognize their greatness and their significance, but we don't recognize a connection. And I think that's his point, that we feel a connection to Rome. And it's clear that the founding fathers of the United States felt that connection. I mean, all the architecture, many of the things that they talked about, they were drawing directly on, the Roman legal tradition and political sort of philosophy that we get secondhand from Rome. I think he's right. I think the empire never ended. I think it had some dark patches. Do you remember that episode of Star Trek, the original Trek, the only Trek, where they go to this planet and they see a gladiatorial combat on television, and it turns out that the Empire kind of just continued on that planet and then modernized and was like 20th century Earth, except it had everything, gladiators and all that kind of stuff. That was a fun episode. But anyway, I think that they were tapping into that too.
Yeah. Now, the medieval historian in me is going to react a little bit to this. What happens to Rome is it gets transformed in some pretty significant ways in the Middle Ages. When you look at medieval society, what emerges in medieval society is an amalgamation of Rome plus Germanic culture plus Christianity. Then the further along you get, when you're getting to, let's say, the 11th to 12th century, you start seeing a resurgence of interest in Roman law. And then in the 14th century, you get a resurgence of interest in Roman history and culture and all that. We call that the Renaissance. So there is a thread of Rome that continues all through all of this. I made the argument in my book, Why You Think the Way You Do, that Western civilization is really the product of Rome plus Christianity. I sort of dropped the Germans there. But as we are de-Christianizing, my conclusion was we're going back to Rome. It's because that's the residue. That's what's left when you remove the Christian components of it. And while Rome had some very impressive features, at its core, it was a society that was built on slavery, devaluation of human life, a whole bunch of things that are really negative. And we're seeing a lot of those things coming back.
Yeah. I wonder, related to that, about vestiges of Christianity sort of also being with us. We've talked a lot about how wokeism is a kind of Christianity without Christ, Christianity without forgiveness, that kind of stuff.
Well, actually, jumping ahead a little bit in the article, my favorite example of this is Thor, the Marvel movies. When you actually take a look at Thor, the first, the origin story, the origin movie, the idea that Odin is essentially a peacenik who doesn't want to have war with the frost giants, and Thor is a bad boy because he's trying to fight the frost giants, and he has to learn to sacrifice himself for the good of others and love of his friends and all of that. I walked out the first time I saw that movie. I walked out and said, "This is the triumph of Christianity," because that notion of the Norse gods would have been unrecognizable to anybody who worshiped them. It is absolutely absurd. If we actually presented the Norse gods as they were, nobody would view them as the heroes.
Yeah, that's right. And he's going to go there, and I'm going to get there. I don't want to jump too far ahead, but it is, a lot of this stuff is intertwined, so it's easy to get there. But there's some important things I think discussed when he gets to that dimension of it. But before he jumps into it, says something about, he says, what I mean is that today's West is really just Rome under a different name. But what he's going by here is it's the fact that despite the Christian or pseudo-Christian veneer, Western culture still really has many of the same values as those of Rome. And I think then he goes, true, we don't have slaves anymore. And he's going to describe those things as, Christian influence. But one of the things he talks about, but we're still in some ways Roman. We still valorize power and straight lines. We still have emperors, even though we call them presidents, and we still have empires, even though we pretend not to. We still build vast amphitheaters for entertainment, even if the entertainment is an AC/DC concert or a Premier League match instead of Lions versus Slaves face-off. We still use Corinthian columns to demonstrate our social status. And I think he's talking about there's this lingering or this hangover that hasn't gone away and hasn't gotten out of the way, and that we are still its heirs in many ways more. And this is one of the continuing, lingering effects of it that stays in us when we think about how closer we are to it than the Babylonian Empire, for example.
Yeah, I guess, too, the Christianization of the West, as Tom Holland has brought out, was a kind of purgation, not necessarily a starting from scratch, if you get my drift. I mean, so
Yeah.
there are these continuing um, sort of lines of connection that exist, but we have worked hard to kind of sever those lines that we didn't want to bring forward in time. Obviously, slavery being the most obvious example. Now, it doesn't mean we didn't have a rebirth of slavery
Yeah.
for a period of time, but there were a lot of things that kind of were part of that mix that were unusual and I think kind of unrepeatable. For example, there's a bunch of Arabs going down into Africa and taking captive people and selling them. So there had to be a supply. It wasn't just the demand. There was also a supply.
Well, actually, hold on a moment here. The Romans began developing a slave economy after they had basically expanded into a de facto empire in the Mediterranean. It's after they conquered Carthage. That's where they learned about these large cash crop estates run by slaves. Prior to that, Rome didn't have any of this stuff. So they imitated the Carthaginians actually in developing these large plantation. It's really literally plantation agriculture, large estates, cash crop run by slaves. They were called latifundia. When the Europeans, the Portuguese starting with this, began expanding out, and they hit the Azores, the Madeira Islands, and so on, and are going down Africa, they self-consciously imitated the Romans, who were imitating the Carthaginians, by setting up plantation agriculture. And then they exported that to their colonies in the New World. So there is actually, in terms of the resurgence of slavery, that is actually very much a direct result of imitating Rome, taking the ideas from the Roman Empire and reapplying them after they'd largely died out in Europe prior to that.
And yeah, but something he noted early in the article when he was just talking about the Colosseum itself and its history, that not everyone realizes that was built a lot by that slave labor taken, especially from a lot of the Jews that were conquered, the way he was putting it. Of course, you have the great symbols of that all over Rome, the conquering of Jerusalem and the celebration of it.
Arch of Titus, yeah.
Yeah.
Trajan's column.
Yeah.
Not Trajan, Titus, Arch of Titus.
Yeah. And so I think he has a fair point to reflect on is that, I mean, I think we've talked about it before in relationship to Augustine's work and the continuing significance. And now everyone's writing a book on the continuing significance of how to apply Augustine to the problems of our age. But there is a sense in which reading the wisdom of someone who lived right in the heart of it can help you see echoes of its lingering effect, which is part of, for Augustine, fallen humanity anyway. Anytime power gets severed from the cross in a way and let loose under the conditions of our fallenness. And so you have sort of this, lust for power and dominating lust, if you will. You have this sense of dominating when you have power, and it's natural for dominating societies to do that and to exploit others. And this notion of self-glory, I think he doesn't get into it a lot here, but we've talked about that before, the way in which so some sense of my own significance and centrality gets hyper exalted, if you will, and centralized. And we have that with identity focus a lot in our culture, this way in which it's all about me and, how I express myself, and you, almost demanding you to give assent to that. Otherwise, there'll be problems. So I think there's a lot of things about this, and I guess you can make the connection there as Rome just exemplified, the way Augustine put it, a lot of these splendid vices that have a certain almost virtuous character to them because they allow civilization and strong civilization, but they also have their own undermining within them.
Yeah, there's also a parallel, I think, at least in the American experience, between sort of the virtuous republic and the corrupt empire, and how we think of our own selves. Obviously there wasn't some, pristine, unfallen state that we enjoyed at one point in American history up until the mid 19th century or something. I'm not implying that, but we do have a kind of mythos about the hard scrabble existence that our ancestors in the New World experienced, and they really were virtuous in many respects, even though we wouldn't necessarily think that they were faultless or sinless. And now we find ourselves in Rome's spot in the sense that we basically, like he notes, there is an empire. The United States is an empire. We don't like to say that, but we are.
Yeah.
We've figured out a way to kind of delude ourselves into thinking that we're not, but we are.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm currently teaching a class on Revelation. And one of the things that's really striking is the very first verse is echoing Daniel 2, Nebuchadnezzar's vision. The vocabulary that John uses there is very deliberately picking up on the vocabulary in Daniel 2. So I've got this on my mind. What you see in Daniel 2 is a vision of a sequence of empires. Babylon, followed by the Medes and Persians, followed by Greece, followed by Rome. And Rome is sort of the pinnacle of these empires. Later, you get the vision of the four beasts coming out of the sea. The last of these, the fourth of them, is going to be Rome, and it is the pinnacle of all of these empires. So in a lot of ways, I would argue that reading Daniel suggests that Rome is sort of the ultimate example for the ancient world, at least, of what empire is. And it is portrayed as being villainous. It is portrayed as being frighteningly powerful and evil and abusive and all of these kinds of things, which is actually a bit of a warning to us that the more we sort of embrace the identity of being Romans, de facto, the more we're going to move into a state of abusiveness and corruption and all of those kinds of things.
I wonder, though,
because empire, as Augustine points out in The City of God, empire is intrinsically part of the city of man.
Yeah. I wonder, though, if there isn't sort of a sub-tradition or sort of a counter-narrative. When we think about people like Augustine or Boethius, who are undeniably Roman, or even Cincinnatus, but at the same time exemplify virtues that call into question the legitimacy of the empire.
Yeah. Well, Cincinnatus was pre-empire. He was republic.
Yeah, but that's the point. He's looked at still as a kind of a founding father, even after the empire. So they're always hearkening back to their virtuous sort of humble beginnings.
Yeah, and Rome, even as an empire, maintained the fiction that it was really a republic.
Right, right. Just like we do.
Yeah. I wasn't going to point that out. I was going to let that hang, but okay.
Spreading democracy. Peaceably all around the world. Pax Americana.
You need to listen to a song from the 60s by Tom Lehrer called Send in the Marines. It's...
related to the parallels, when we think about, say, the founding fathers and the architecture that they commissioned to be erected in Washington, D.C., just even the scale of Washington, D.C., and sort of the way the roads are laid and so forth, it's intended to be a city that can receive its armies in triumph. And I think, there's a kind of conflicted kind of character to the West, generally speaking, in this way. It's not a kind of a seamless robe or a smooth, homogeneous story. It's got kind of counter narratives in it.
Yeah. There are tensions that,
Yeah.
I mean, Christianity being one of them, these bonds of imperfection that as Donovan used to put it, that are established, that often push against its center and core. I mean, this is part of the struggle. I mean, this is why they describe a lot, the language of Augustine and stuff is, being on pilgrimage. It's not merely that I can't find my core place here. I'm so heavenly minded. There's nothing going on here. It's much more about this unsettledness, about being in a mixed situation, being ready for and drawing upon kind of the higher virtues, the theological virtues, yet in a setting in which those are resisted and rejected, yet a setting that needs them and calls that setting into its highest calling, the desire of the nations. So there is a kind of, and you see also, I mean, as we'll see in a little bit, we'll see this notion that Christianity does play into, fashion and form and direct empires. I mean, and people in them. I think this is kind of what he's kind of getting onto as well, because the next thing he talks about is going to the cafe in Rome, and there's this young lady who has emblazoned a giant inverted pentagram who is selling the coffee, right? and so he notices this kind of contrast going on here. He goes, in case you were in any doubt as to what this was supposed to convey, the words below it read deicide 666. And then she says, that'll be 20 euros, please, smiling. Being in English, I smiled back. There's a little joke in there. But this is worth quoting. He says, deicide turns out to be the name of a bad metal band, which began life when I was a teenager in the late 80s. As a semi-metaler myself back then, I was a semi-metaler. I was more than familiar with the anti-Christian iconography that was required by any band who wanted to make a splash in the metal scene. From Black Sabbath onwards, if you were praising Satan, wearing inverted crosses and pentagrams, and writing songs with titles like Death to Jesus and others, you were, unless you were doing this, you were in danger of being left behind. But we all knew it was an act. Nobody really believed it. So it was all okay. Most of the guys were probably playing golf in their spare time. I think he's referring to Alice Cooper, right? He was always known to be on the golf course.
Actually, with R.C. Sproul at times.
Yeah, that's right. And so he's getting in this notion of this kind of satanic, witchy, openly neo-pagan iconography that's become fashionable. But he said it's so lost its punch, especially since it's all become so familiar. But he then turns attention to this Ireland's entrant into this year's Eurovision. Now, if people don't know what Eurovision is, it's kind of their big song contest from up-and-coming acts in Europe. And pretty much everyone watches it, even though it's these mostly horrible bands and acts playing.
Before we get to Eurovision, can I just make a comment about Black Sabbath?
Yeah.
I actually heard an interview with Ozzy. And he said, they had this band put together and they were trying to figure out what to do. And he noticed all of these people going to movie theaters and watching horror movies. And he said, well, I guess people like to be scared. Maybe we should do something scary to make us, maybe that will make us popular. And that's why they created Black Sabbath.
Yeah. Yeah, you can see some of the kind of theater of the absurd in their stuff too. They definitely were using film ideas to drive that. And there wasn't there a film by that title, if I remember? Black Sabbath was one of those early horror films.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah. So anyway, this year's entrance, for example, or the one when he wrote this, was called from Ireland, was called Bambi Thug. And Bambi is an openly anti-Christian, non-binary witch who performs what she calls Ouija pop. Her songs include spells and hexes, and in her spare time, she likes to practice blood magic. All of this makes her entirely uncontroversial in 2024. In fact, unlike the God-hating pioneers of the 70s and 80s, it's pretty much mainstream. After all, other mainstream acts like Sam Smith and Lil Nas X have also been working hard to push pagan Satan witch thing to the max. So it's one of the things as he's talking about is it can't, as much as they're trying to do all of this culture of inversion, it really has become so flat and mainstream that it doesn't even have the punch. And this is what we talked about a while back with people now having to walk around naked, because all shock factor has pretty much been knocked out of the entertainment world to grab your attention.
Yeah, which brings up something I think worth maybe a show sometime, and that is how modesty makes so many things possible.
Yeah.
If you don't have modesty, obviously you don't have shock. You don't have these other things. Modesty also has a way of sort of heightening, this is a paradox, kind of the erotic and making it more potent. But again, that's lost on our elites today. They're pretty bland bunch.
Well, you actually get a similar example in language, in the use of the four-letter words. The best example of this is a movie I really don't like. It's Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. You go through the entire movie, and you got all this action stuff and things like that, and then Indiana Jones is on, if I remember the situation right, he's on this rope bridge, and he's got enemies on both sides of it. He's sort of trapped in the middle. And right there, he drops a four-letter Germanic word. And it has a much bigger impact than it would in other movies, because he's never done it before, and you're not hearing these things. The very fact that the language had been clean the entire movie meant that when he dropped it, it actually had an impact, whereas it would never have done so in a typical movie today.
It's interesting. Karl Barth was known to hide Martin Luther's works in places because the language of Luther was so crass and offensive that he didn't want any of the children or anyone getting a hold of that work. So he would hide Luther's works in places.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
So
Catholics know all about that. That's one of those things that they make certain everybody knows, is that he had a foul mouth.
Yeah. But the next connection he makes here, and he goes, what is the connection between Bambi Thug, deicide, and our continued fascination with ancient Rome? And he pretty obviously, the answer is that none of these things are Christian, one. In fact, they're all openly anti-Christian, and we are increasingly and obviously an anti-Christian culture. It is often suggested that the West is anti-religious. And he goes on to say, no, we allow for religion all over the place. We just have a problem with Christianity fundamentally, or anything that resonates of it. And he puts it this way, a great line: the West is not really against religion. What it is against is its own heritage, and that heritage happens to be Christian. And so when he talks about this, what he calls the culture of inversion is the result of the 20th century social and cultural revolution, which has likened to a new Reformation. It has manifested in the sexual revolution of the 60s, the accelerating trends towards individualism, radical liberation, and technological solutionism. It is a result of the reshaping of nations, families, cultures, and values of all kind. Most of all, it has manifested in a rejection, conscious or unconscious, of the religion of Christianity. And he's saying, for better or worse, the West is now being superseded, and we are leaving what we were behind.
Yeah, he notes at the same time that there's nothing really filling the void.
Yeah.
This idea that we have a kind of pagan sort of resurgence is something he doesn't buy. He thinks it's all LARPing, live action role play, and people don't really mean it, which gets us back to the Black Sabbath illustration and deicide and all that kind of stuff. I think there's something to that. I do think that there are, people who take these things seriously. And Glenn has brought up, in the past, the fact that we do live in a sort of dark enchantment world, and I do think there are. Maybe it has something to do with the fact that he's in Europe and not in the Americas, for example, where we have kind of a very strong, particularly, coming out of Mexico, and Haiti and places like that, very strong kind of Aboriginal, spiritual traditions that never died.
Well, yeah, that I think is true, and I think that would be a big qualification. Is I think he's definitely talking about the West and the loss of its kind of internal issue, rather than the fact that these places that were fundamentally still very pagan in classical senses of the word, maybe have had some Christian influence, but it's been much more filtered through indigenous kind of pagan and religion.
Yeah, syncretistic, really. Like
Yeah.
if you think of Haiti, right?
Yeah, things like that. And so I definitely don't think that was on his radar, but that is a good qualification. But I think one of the things he does catch is that when he talks about the West becoming repaganized, it's not the same point we've made when we talk about kind of the return of pagan. I think what he's trying to say is that the West itself has, for all of its attempts, other than the dark corners of a return to this, is you don't find much by way of the kind of popular trend of paganizing as it inverts Christianity from left to right, of people willing to really die for it. Now, I would add another qualification. I do think you see it when it comes to political. You do see, we saw it during all of these riots and everything else, people willing to get violent and escalate over woke causes, which are oftentimes filtered through this kind of cultural inversion and negation of anything to do. They wrap anything to do with Christian heritage under the notion of oppressive, a culture of oppression. So you will see people willing to at least get violent over that. I don't know how far they're willing to die. They're willing to kill for it. But I think this more, he uses the example, for example, of recently at the Olympics. And he uses that example where they basically, created this, what was it, the Last Supper scene, or hints of a Last Supper scene, but it was so decked out in all these kind of pagan figures and everything else that you didn't really know what they were up to, and they were almost half committed to it. So as soon as criticism came up, they ran away from and kind of
yeah, it's almost as though they had their backstory already scripted. It's just like, okay, if there are still Christians who can be offended about something like this is where we'll go. It's like, okay, we'll jump into that, to that barricade and fight it out from there. But at that point, they've already conceded the argument. This really wasn't about Christianity. It was just something else.
And that's why he was talking a little bit earlier. He talks about, sort of paganism often ends up making practical sense in kind of more sinister ways, besides just worshiping creaturely things or finding God in all things. He said sometimes justifying infanticide, sacrificing animals or humans to capricious nature-bound gods, or simply reducing us to the base level of our humanity. And he contrasts that with what we often call the new pagans, but he calls them, they're really Christians in disguise. And I think he has the Dawkins of the world kind of in mind, where they want to brush off Christianity and fill it with nothing. And yet they kind of embrace the kind of generic Christian ethic or ethics that owe itself to Christianity.
Yeah. You see that in most neo-pagan groups, who at least give lip service to things that their pagan ancestors would have found laughable.
Yes.
That is true as well. There are some exceptions, and the ones who are exceptions are really dangerous, frankly.
Yeah.
But a lot of the new pagan groups are very much like that. They're Christianized pagans, just like the Thor movie is a Christianized version of Norse.
That's right.
The thing that I found interesting here, there are a couple of things about this that really caught my eye. But one of them is, I have a former student who will go nameless, who I'm friends with him, and he's one of these people that I actually consulted with him when I was writing articles on new paganism, because he was a flat out pagan. He worshipped ancient deities. For various reasons, because of stuff that he's doing, I would describe it on the side, but it might be sort of related to his professional life. He has decided that he would move away from his tutelary pagan deities and instead switch over to Zoroastrianism because it aligned with some other stuff that he was doing. And what that told me is that he really wasn't as committed to his paganism as he seemed to be.
Right.
And when I was originally talking, so this is almost the LARPing kind of thing, it seems to me,
Yeah.
Right.
that he was talking about.
Yeah. And go ahead, Chris.
It gets to this. So Kingsnorth brings up kind of the aesthetic.
Yeah.
That there's an aesthetic that is being put on display here. It's for show.
Yeah. Yeah, it is definitely. I think that's his great way of putting it, because he says, for example, their values in their emphasis, human rights or feminism or ecological sensitivity and broadly liberal views, are derived from, again, their truths gone mad because they've been ripped from their doctrinal framework, but they're derived from Christianity. And the old gods they claim to worship have suspiciously modern attitudes,
right,
and dispositions, and really the same thing. The dignity of an identity, especially a marginalized identity, would have never resonated in any significant form in any of these forms of paganism in that sense. The fact that you should be including in a fair way those that are marginally weak by social standards and therefore need the political system to prop them up. I mean, Nietzsche would have nothing of that. It just, and I think there is a subtle conversation or interaction with some Nietzschean themes I'll get to in a moment here, but I think he's hinting around that, and that's why he moves it to the aesthetic, because I think that's sort of what Nietzsche kind of calls a lot of this stuff, creating a different aesthetic. Because if we were really repaganizing, we would be returning to the worship of the old gods, and yet, despite all the satanic witchery of popular culture, we're not actually doing so. What we're seeing is the likes of Bambi Thug and Sam Smith. It's not the resurgence of the threatening kind. Again, we're admitting that there is some of this, but not in this kind of popular cultural inversion. It is an aesthetic. Nobody would die for it. No one would really fight for it. It is LARPing and play acting rather than signifying a sinister new development or threatening new faith. It is a flimsy veil drawing on a gaping void. And this is kind of, we've talked about the different types of nihilism, but in this case, there is this kind of aesthetic nihilism, if you will. Mike Hanby used to call it ontology of boredom, that really comes, and he really ties it to the West, and we've talked about it a million times, the way in which once voluntarism gets run loose and liberty and freedom for its own sake without any limit, direction, or guidance, but absolute freedom, it becomes its own kind of hell. And he argues that that's sort of where we are now. We're living with the consequences of our own liberation. We got everything we wanted. Now we have to live with it. And so we got all the riches of what the contribution of Christianity to a culture has. Instead of building on those and cultivating them and the like, we took those rich things, severed them from their roots, and ran in our own direction with them. Didn't want anyone to get in the way, not family, not any kind of natural limit, not any kind of social limit. And we've created this cesspool where the only thing that we even know by habit to run to that has any kind of significance for us is just to invert and be against the Christian heritage and its impact.
The thing that I think Kingsnorth missed here is the last battle in Narnia. The point, one of the points Lewis is making there is you have the ape, I forgot his name, who is creating this fake religion, bringing Tash and Aslan together and all of that. And he doesn't believe a word of it. But in the midst of doing this, without realizing it, he is summoning Tash, and Tash shows up. The demon arrives. And it seems to me the danger in all of this that he doesn't really address is that there are genuine call them supernatural, I prefer invisible powers out there that these guys are invoking. And sooner or later, they may very well show up, and maybe they're already showing up in ways that we're not recognizing. And that, it seems to me, is a danger that he doesn't really address. I suspect he's aware of it, but it's not something that he really talks about at all in the article. And I think it should have at least gotten a tip of the hat.
Well, I know that he's a supernaturalist, and he does address kind of dark enchantment through AI. There was a cover story on Touchstone where they reprinted one of his Substack pieces along that line. I think that there's a lot to that. This ties into Lewis's famous seventh letter from Screwtape to Wormwood in Screwtape Letters, where Wormwood has asked, "Should I reveal myself to my patient?" And Wormwood's Screwtape's response is, the policy has been established from the high, from on high, that we're to remain hidden for the time being. But there is this prospect that we might be able to create the materialist magician who, in everything but name, believes in us, but thereby leaves the prospect of believing in the other side out of the question. And I think that there's something to that. I've been doing a lot of thinking about transhumanism lately, and it's an eschatology. When you think about immanentizing the eschaton, Vogelin's warning, don't do that. Most of us mentally go to the kingdom of God and sort of the social features that we see, in the early book of Acts, and that kind of stuff, and how left-wing efforts to immanentize the eschaton give us communism and stuff like that. But transhumanism goes to the body, and it does the same thing. What it's looking for is the glorified body. It's looking for a resurrection without a judgment. It's looking for a glorification without the spirit. And so what you're actually trying to create is the divinized body, the glorified body, through technical means. And is there something demonic in that? Are there some other, you have people sometimes who are dismissive and say, oh, it's just software and that kind of thing. Well, the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 10 said it's just stone and wood, but by the way, there are also demons there. Make sure you don't mess with those idols. So just because something is software doesn't mean that the demonic can't be in some sense bound up with it. Just because an idol is stone and nothing to it doesn't mean that the demonic can't have something to do with it.
That's right. And sadly, there were, when I taught it in my ethics class, a couple of terms, they end it with transhumanism, added it to the class. One of the things that was surprising is you have otherwise Orthodox, a handful of Orthodox Christians, and capital O Orthodox, not many. I'm not condemning them. I'm just saying figures that are contributing to a conversation, arguing that maybe that's one of the means through which resurrection and the resurrection body is going to be kind of prepared for.
Right. I've heard the same thing. There was a collection. I've observed that there are very few real treatments of transhumanism by Christians. I mean, obviously, there's 2084 by John Lennox, which is a great book. I'm about 2/3 of the way through that. You recommended it, Glenn. It's a good book. But it's surprising how few there are. It seems like everybody and his brother has written something about wokeism. No one, hardly anyone gets into it. But there is a collection of essays from the full spectrum of religious backgrounds. And some of them in this book I'm thinking of are Christians, and they're advocating for what you just said, Tom, that this is the means, of our liberation. This is what,
carrying it out.
The resurrection of Christ was always pointing to, is the transhumanism.
It was one of my students who, we were covering all the topics, and she raised a question in the class. She said, I never hear anyone talk about this transhumanism. Can I write my case study on it? Well, after she wrote it, I was like, this needs to be something included. And so I concluded it as the kind of the final topic when dealing with theology and eschatology in that. And that's where I was surprised very much so that, again, there's a lot of essays and stuff you can find out there, but not comprehensive treatments. You are starting to see people deal with the AI dimensions and things like that. But you have these kind of, these strange trends that become captivating to people sometimes who even believe kind of core Orthodox doctrines that somehow jump on these things without a whole lot of critical evaluation, or the kind they do is definitely showing a different relationship to creation and technology than I think a lot of us as Christians would want to grant.
Yeah, I actually was working on a book on transhumanism and AI. It got put on the back shelf, but you're right. There's really very little sources from a Christian perspective that you can go to give you material to work with.
Yeah, I was surprised. The guys at New St. Andrews are very sharp, well read. I did my first lecture in my series there, on St. Anthony and all of the things that I'm dealing with in this series in the bookum. But as you probably know, I'm sure you do, that I start off with transhumanism, and none of them had ever even given any serious consideration to it, which is just so startling when you consider just how much is being invested in it financially, for one thing, and in terms of research. I mean, all you need to do is just do a simple Google search on transhumanism, and you discover billions and billions of dollars are being invested in the whole project.
The real ethical, or not the real, a strong flood of ethical issues that the church will confront in the future coming out of the technological world. They just are. And they are what make any ideology also dangerous. I mean, we are always spending time, and we have to, engaging these ideologies and these ideas as they try to get a chokehold on the church and its witness and culture. But we are going to find ourselves at a radical odds if we can't keep up and digest where technology is going to be going. It's again, we're dealing with magic of a high order.
And I believe that there's a seduction to it that maybe appeals to some people who just have no interest in the woke phenomenon.
Yeah.
So I think that's the thing that I'm picking up on, is that there's a whole different set who would be completely on board with our condemnations of the insanities that come out of woke town. But find the whole transhumanist thing really seductive.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you can look at someone like Elon Musk, who with Neuralink is really thinking about downloading consciousness and things like that, which I would argue is fundamentally a category error. But there you have it. Kurzweil is, of course, one of the great ones in this. The thing about transhumanism is it goes in a whole bunch of different directions. Are we talking about downloading your consciousness? Are we talking about life extension? Are we talking about reprogramming genetics, genetic engineering? Are we talking about enhancement, or are we talking about restoring proper function? There are a whole bunch of things that land under the category of transhumanism. And because it's such a broad area, it's a little difficult to really get hold of, because every one of these raises different questions and different ethical concerns. I don't have a problem, for example, with using technological fixes to repair things that are going wrong, cochlear implants, things like that. Musk is talking right now about something that would connect to the visual cortex, I think it's called, in the brain, that would enable people without eyes or optic nerves or who are blind, as long as the visual cortex is there, it would enable them to see. Initially Atari level, but then refined from there. But then he's talking about taking it beyond just simply restoring sight and moving them into infrared, moving them into ultraviolet, moving them into radar frequencies, things like that. That's beginning to get a little weird.
So it's when does it?
When does it move from restoration to enhancement, and where is the line drawn to trying to create superhuman beings?
Yeah, that's like Geordie and the kind of the new Trek, the next generation.
And he actually cited Geordie as the example.
Yeah, and I'm with you on that. I think that it's not a clear cut good evil kind of thing. That's where this becomes so vexing, is because you are talking about sort of gradations, and when have you gone too far in a particular direction? And that's a huge conversation, I think, and I do think, for example, what's going on with Neuralink with helping paraplegics is really remarkable stuff. It's stuff that we want to encourage, and we should celebrate. On the other hand, it's sort of like, when I think this is the appropriate comparison: nuclear power. You can light a city or level it with the same technology, and that's what we're dealing with here. There's a tremendous upside, and I don't want to imply that we shouldn't pursue that upside. I think, when it comes to medicines or material science, AI, for example, is going to be immensely helpful. But when it comes to this other stuff, there's a subtle and not so subtle temptation that I think is the temptation of the Ubermensch, the Superman. I think that's what we're talking about.
Well, and I think that's where, the significance of it for Christians, especially where being immersed in conversations about what the image of God entails, what our embodied natures being image bearers entails, and what is consonant with what is for its good and what is starting to alter and change and trying to make it something more than it is. And see, this is, like you said, this gets a little, on the spiritual level, this gets a little hairy, because there are certain things we are meant to be transformed. We are meant to be perfected, right? But we aren't meant to be perfected by technological means. We are meant to be perfected by the work of Christ in the Spirit, which includes a killing off and a dying that as well. And so, this is something that wants to skip over these. And I was reading Peter Harrison, the history of, the significance of Adam's fall in shaping modern science, and with Bacon in particular, and, the whole founding of the Royal Society, and the way in which there was just this excitement about the way in which everything restored now in Christ could almost bring us back to the encyclopedic mind of Adam, right? Who could look at something and see its essence and immediately, connect with it. And all of these abilities Adam must have had prior to the fall. And that maybe through science is kind of going to be the recovery of all of this and the going beyond all of this. And so this attempt to make the mind like that, or if we could develop technologies to make us see in, the way we use with binoculars or something else, but implant that. This kind of, is this what Adam was like? Can we restore that? So it was really in a lot of the kind of imagination of some of these early figures. And I think it was a Reverend South, who was an Oxford priest, who gave a sermon during Christopher Wren's, the opening of the Sheldonian Theater there in the Royal Society, one of their first meetings. And he kind of scowled at him. He said, you still need to do your scientific research by candlelight. And his point was the Augustinian point, that the fall's effects are still with us, and you can't skip over them in your attempts to have the healing of all things.
The idea that somehow technology is exempt strikes me as biblically unsound. A couple of reasons. One is Tubal Cain, who is Lamech's son, who's the guy who basically, kind of says, I'm just going to ratchet up this tit for tat thing to the point where I'm willing to wipe out entire populations if you wrong me. And then Babel. You got the first large scale communal technological sort of achievement, and it's spiritually questionable at best.
And it's interesting, back to a point we were talking about earlier, before all this, when you mentioned kind of the spiritual subtlety and deception that can often be hidden and then unleashed from almost looking at the fact that nobody really believes in this stuff, and yet they're indulging in it anyway. I remember an article back before Dave Bentley Hart went kind of weird on some things, but his famous that we've quoted a bit is one on Christ or nihilism or something along these lines. First things, but there was something he said in there. So basically, when Christ came and the church claimed the lordship of Christ, he gutted the world of its false gods and their powers. There's no place for it to go. There is the only place that isn't claimed by Christ, and his power is nowhere. I mean, he's come to fill all things. And again, he hasn't filled all things in his perfection yet, but nevertheless, the claim is there. So nowhere, the nothing, the nihil is pretty much the only place to go. And so what he talks about, the way in which people will hang their little, kind of trinkets in their cars and all their little neo-pagan things and burn their incense and do their yoga. And he said, but really, these things have kind of a deceptive allure to them. Nobody really believes in their enchantment the way when they first arose in real kind of pagan world. But on the flip side, there's a deeper danger there, because the real delusion and power that's unleashed is that we tend to think of them as nothing but expressions of our choice, and our choice and our individuality expressing itself, which has become the real new God. And that sense of choice is governed by a notion of liberty and freedom that has no premise. We conjure it into being. I think that's more demonic in its output than much of the pagan world that at least had some kind of reason or logos or something to temper the will than this sort of thing.
There's a kind of a cat mom kind of silly crystal magic chick thing going on. Who was that actress a few years back who was promoting kind of new age thoughts? And
Shirley MacLaine.
That's right. Yeah. That's it. I remember she thought reincarnation was like this wonderful thing. She obviously had no understanding of what reincarnation meant in the Eastern thought. It's like, I have to live again, this hell again. She thought it was some kind of cute fuzzy.
There was a Far Side cartoon where there are two Gila monsters in the desert. One of them is saying to the other, there it is again, this feeling that in a past life I was someone named Shirley MacLaine.
That's perfect. Yeah. I mean, but that's the level of sophistication that we're dealing with when it comes to the Hollywood People magazine crowd when they get into yoga and that kind of stuff. It really is LARPing and kind of comic.
Yeah, but I think what it masks in all of that is a kind of enslavement and ensnarement that is harder to convince people they're enslaved or ensnared, because they feel like it's their free choice and their identity that is embracing it. And that is much harder to speak a gospel of liberation into, because they don't think of it. They see themselves as freed from anything that qualifies their absolute freedom. And so there is something, a void, as he may put it, but I think it isn't simply just a time that's going to pass away. I think it has its own demonic character that needs to be cast out.
Yeah, I agree. There are so many different odd kind of features to this time that we find ourselves in that I think have everything to do with this nihilism, the void that we're talking about here, and how we are unwilling to exchange the void for something of substance because it means that we've lost our choices. We look at the void as freedom.
And it's interesting because, when you think about it, I know he had a lot of things going on there and everyone wants to interpret it another way, but even with Nietzsche, God is dead and we've killed him. In many ways, he's talking about the way in which the notion of God had lost its aesthetic appeal and nobody was willing to die for it anymore.
Yeah,
and
I think
once that goes.
Yeah, this is where, your typical mainstream evangelical demonstrates that they don't know what they're talking about when they use God is dead as some actual thing that Nietzsche was celebrating, when in fact he was sort of saying, I've got some bad news for you. Now what are we going to do? That was his real point. Anyway, so this has been a fun conversation. I've enjoyed it. Anything you guys want to say as we wrap up? I guess not.
I think we said enough.
Well, thank you for listening to this episode of the Theology Pugcast. It's been great to have you sit in on this. And if you'd like to support what we do, there is a link in the show notes to our Patreon page. And when you get to that page, you'll see how you can help us out. Anyway, that's enough for now. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The Theology Pugcast is a ministry of Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville, Alabama. To learn more about the church, you can visit trinityreformedkirk.com. trinityreformedkirk.com.